to travel abroad, buying arms. Francis was an extremely efficient and highly experienced former head of the Foreign Service. So that what purportedly happened seems extraordinary. It appears that very few arms were obtained for the very large sums of money taken out of Biafra. It was claimed that Francis and his mission were duped by unscrupulous arms dealers. $20 million of foreign exchange were rapidly depleted in dubious deals. Yet, those involved were the cream of Nigeria's civil service. $20 million was an awful lot of duping. The Nigerian government responded by canceling Nwokedi's passports and belatedly trying to stop the flow of currency from the East. Francis had once been the dutiful advisor to the British, and then after independence, to the British-backed northern rulers of Nigeria. When Ironsi took over, Francis was by his side, and now Ironsi was dead. He was General Ojukwu's lieutenant and right-hand man. Aaron Smith wrote, "The betrayal of Biafra." Apart from those amongst the minority ethnic groups within the eastern region who, as a matter of conscience, did not buy into the Biafran cause, there was the added compilation of the former Nigerian army officers who had been implicated in the coup and who appear to have been transferred to prisons in the region as part of advanced war planning strategy. Ojukwu had been persuaded to release them from prison in January 1967 at the time of the Aburi Accord. If the theory that the January 1966 coup was an Igbo plot had any merit, these coup plotters might have been expected to have been loyal to the Biafran cause, but the opposite appears to have been the case. Principal amongst this was Ogun, the leader of the coup plot. Having first been held in Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison in Lagos, following his arrest, by a series of transfers, he ended up in the Eastern region. In May 1967, days before the declaration of Biafra, he had made his opposition to secession clear. He said, Ogun, secession will be ill-advised, indeed impossible. Even if the East fights a war of secession and wins, it still cannot succeed. Personally, I don't like secession, and if this country disintegrates, I shall pack up my things and go. In the present circumstances, confederation is the best answer as a temporary measure. In time, we shall have complete unity. That he had no loyalty to the Biafran cause and may, in fact, have been working with the federal side is suggested by a letter that he wrote to Olusegun Obasanjo on 17th June 1967, just a couple of weeks before the outbreak of the war. Ogun wrote to Obasanjo, "You have no doubt heard a lot of rumors about my relations with Ojukwu. We obviously see things quite differently after what he did to my supporters in January 1966. He is also worried about my popularity among his own people. I was to be put back into prison, but he was afraid of the repercussions. Right now, I am not allowed contact with troops, nor am I permitted to operate on the staff. One gentleman's agreement which we have is that I can carry on with whatever pleases me. You can't be in any doubt about the fact that if I have financial and logistic support, I will create a new Nigerian army inside Biafra with Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba, and all other ethnic groups. Let me know whether anyone in authority there in Lagos is ready to support me. If he is, I like contact to be established soonest." That was Ogun's letter to Obasanjo. It was perhaps not surprising that Unzeogu was killed soon after hostilities commenced on 6th July 1967. The intriguing element is that he was killed on 29th July 1967, the very anniversary of the counter coup. Even more beguiling is the care that the federal forces took to retrieve his corpse 2 days later and to fly it to Kaduna to be buried in the military cemetery, even while the war was going on. On one level, this honor that was paid to him in death and the fact that his family escaped the war crimes inflicted on men, women, and children from his hometown, Asaba, can be put down to special favor from his friend, Obasanjo. That it was an act of appreciation from the very highest level can, however, be discerned from the fact that even while he was in Kirikiri prison in Lagos, he had been receiving VIP treatment. So according to him, Unzeogu, Ifeajuna and my colleagues in the South made such a nonsense of this affair, with results that people are accusing us of being one-sided. The so-called loyalist troops under the influence of the Supreme Commander, egged on by certain tribalists, encouraged private soldiers and NCOs to cane and maltreat some of these officers and men now in Kirikiri, whilst they were under detention in the Federal Guard and in 2nd Battalion. They were beaten with kobokos daily, starved, and forced to drink urine at gunpoint. Ungobosi nearly had his eyes poked out with a rifle muzzle. And Oyewole, who is still admitted in the military hospital, had his forehead and nose smashed to bits with a rifle in the presence of Ekanem, Captain Iwe, Major Ali, and a few other loyalist officers. If you see the men here in prison, you will be sorry for them. Koboko and bayonet wounds all over the face and body. It is terrible. In fairness to them, loyalists, they were probably acting so in order to please some faction of the army that felt the human loss. But that is not how to soldier. We get VIP treatments in the prison, and all the warders and prisoners respect me as head of the revolutionary group. That was Unzeogu. The special treatment accorded to Unzeogu is curious because it was he who had murdered the revered northern leader, Ahmadu Bello. It is also the more curious that it is said that he received a full military burial in Kaduna, the political capital of the North, with a 21-gun salute. Victor Adebukola Banjo was another former officer in the Nigerian army who was also a firm believer in one Nigeria, who found himself in prison on the Biafran side of the front until he was released by Ojukwu in January 1967. He had been named and jailed by Ironsi regime as having been one of the coup plotters, although there is reason to doubt the truth of this. No one has been able to say exactly how Victor Banjo became involved with the January Revolution for him to be detained by Ironsi. But Victor Banjo became the only colonel in the Nigerian army detained for a major coup, a thing he had absolutely no knowledge of. In fact, Banjo was so opposed to the January Revolution and revolutionaries alike that he even called and threatened the Unzeogu group at Kaduna soon after Ironsi took over Lagos. He too was killed not long after hostilities commenced. His real offense appears to have been that as a graduate in mechanical engineering, he was one of the new generation of educated officers who the army regarded with suspicion. Why those who had been implicated in the coup, but who were not committed to Biafra, remained in the eastern region up until the outbreak of the war in January 1967 requires explanation. That Ojukwu appointed Nze Ogun to take charge of the Nsukka front when he was known to be loyal to the ideal of one Nigeria also requires explanation. In the case of Victor Banjo, he is said to have ended up joining the Biafran Liberation Army, which Ojukwu set up to liberate the western region from northern occupation, only after General Gowon had rebuffed his appeal for release. After Gowon was installed in power from August 1966, Lieutenant Colonel Banjo made several overtures to him for his release. Gowon refused to release him, even though he, Gowon, knew perfectly well that Banjo had not played any part in the coup. The only condition he gave Banjo was the latter could be transferred back to a prison in Lagos. Banjo did not accept the offer. The Biafran Liberation Army's mission of taking the battle into the western region would have been ambitious in normal circumstances, given the distances and the logistical challenges. With the Biafrans already facing extreme challenges in defending their own enclave, the move is difficult to comprehend. Ojukwu's appointment of Banjo as head of the Biafran Liberation Army to lead the Biafran counter-attack against the Nigerians also does not sit well with the claim that the Igbos had already been betrayed by the Yoruba leader, Awolowo, into declaring secession. In this climate in which truth was hard to separate from fiction, it should come as no surprise that Victor Banjo's fate was to be accused and tried with Emmanuel Ifeajuna and two others, Major Philip Alale and Sam Agbam, for treason against Biafra. As the story goes, on the 9th of August 1967, it was reported that the Liberation Army had captured the Midwest and had reached Ore in its drive to capture Lagos, when the operation was sabotaged by Banjo and Ifeajuna by halting the advance on Lagos. It was said that the decision was made as part of a plot to overthrow Ojukwu and end the war through reconciliation with Nigeria. Their plea of innocence have been dismissed. After a trial, they were executed on Ojukwu's order on the 25th September. The Biafrans fought on bravely against impossible odds until such will to fight as they still had was finally destroyed by a propaganda coup that was handed to the federal side when Nnamdi Azikiwe, who since the outbreak of the war had been holed up in London, writing his autobiography, ultimately published in 1970, landed in Lagos on the 17th August 1969 to be received by Gowon. Zik had become a prize catch for the federal government, and General Gowon immediately saw in his return to the fold, if for nothing else, the propaganda value which he exploited to good advantage. With one stone, therefore, General Gowon was able to kill the proverbial two birds by taking Zik along with him to the OAU summits at Addis Ababa in September 1969. He was able to finish Biafra off diplomatically once and for all. And secondly, the grand reception and the courtesies accorded Zik on his return to Nigeria helped in no small way in destroying the myth of Biafra by removing the morbid fear that had grieved all Biafrans concerning the alleged intentions of the Nigerians to annihilate all Biafran males of 10 years and above, which was no doubt the mainstay of the Biafran resistance. Azikiwe again. Wow. Just as he had abandoned the radical Zik movement, who had drawn their inspiration from his speeches when the group was outlawed in April 1950, so again Azikiwe, who had been responsible for igniting Igbo nationalism, abandoned those whom he had inspired in their hour of need. On 28 August, he made the following pronouncements. Azikiwe, knowing that the accusation of genocide is probably false, but bearing in mind the widespread killing of 1966, which must always haunt our memories, why should some people continue to fool our people to believe that they are slated for slaughter when we know that they suffer mental anguish and physical agony as a result of their being homeless and their places of abode having been desolated by war and their lives rendered helpless? Ironically, just 3 months before, on 30th May 1969, the second anniversary of the declaration of Biafra, Bruce Mayrock, a 24-year-old American of Jewish descent, who was a medical student at Columbia University in New York, burned himself to death in front of the United Nations building in protest over the genocide in Biafra. The war's end. The general elections, which were looming in Britain in the summer of 1970, was a significant influence on the war coming to an end in that January. Biafra was Britain's own Vietnam, a war that was competing for the headlines at the same time. The Nigerian army was viewed as conducting a proxy war for Britain's oil interests with just cause. The army had been put together and trained by Britain. General Gowon, the leader of the federal forces, had been trained at Sandhurst. The Biafran forces were led by Colonel Ojukwu, who had been trained at Eton Hall, Chester. It was Britain that was providing the arms and the credit for the prosecution of the war. Harold Wilson had hoped for a short war. As the conflict became drawn out, the moral ground on which he was standing became more difficult. He needed a quick end to the war, but the end had to be on terms of Biafran acceptance of the principle of a united Nigeria, that is, Biafran surrender. A quick victory meant a resort to more desperate measures, including area bombardment of the Biafrans by hired Egyptian pilots. In the words of Ademoyega, now talking about air raids, it is extremely necessary to speak the truth here and now that the federal forces performed horror. These raids, even as perceived from behind bars, were indiscriminate in their choice of victims. Detention camps, refugee camps, prisons, hospitals, markets, schools, private and public homes, churches, and every conceivable target, even trees and grasses. Those raids of severe intensity and extent of were ceaseless, producing a most horrifying and most disgusting spectacle that could be perpetrated in any community of human beings. The ceasefire sought by the Biafrans could not be granted as it was seen as a delaying tactic. Only conditional surrender would be acceptable. The hard line taken by the Wilson government meant more hostile headlines and more desperate effort for the final victory. Wilson's Labour Party simply could not go to the country to renew its electoral mandate whilst the war was still filling the front pages of British newspapers and the nightly TV news with images of horrific civilian suffering. Reports of atrocities committed by Nigerian forces against Biafrans had already forced the Wilson government to compel the Nigerian government to record the offending commanders, Benjamin Adekunle and Muritala Muhammad, from their commands. In March 1969, increasingly concerned about the stalemate that was developing, Wilson decided to fly to Nigeria for a personal assessment of the progress of the war, or the war effort. That he had ownership of the conflict was clear in the commitments he wanted from General Gowon. I wanted to be satisfied about the willingness of the federal government to negotiate on anything not involving dismemberment of Nigeria. In the event of a military victory, he should let the colonel slip through his hands to safety abroad. It should come as no surprise that the war ended precisely in accordance with Wilson's script, when at 2 a.m. on 11th January 1970, Colonel Ojukwu boarded the last flight from Biafra to safety. Post-war propaganda. The Biafran War essentially a falling out between two former political allies, the northern region and the eastern region, the Hausa Fulani and the Igbos. Their party alliance, the NPC and NCNC alliance, had controlled the Nigerian political space, and the army had been dominated by northerners and easterners, with only a token representation from the western region. And the war had its genesis in the slaughter of Igbos living in the north. However, come the end of the war, in January 1970, an observer might have thought that the war had been between the Yoruba and the Igbo. A Yoruba man, Obafemi Awolowo, was the Minister of Finance, who was said to be responsible for the policy of starvation as an instrument of war that accounted for most of the death of the Igbo side. In an army in which the Yoruba representation had been fairly insignificant, the Yoruba officers suddenly took center stage. The one division led by Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, and a Yoruba man born to a Fulani mother, the 3rd Marine Commando Division, was the spearhead of the federal assaults on Igbo land. In the final act of this tragedy, in fact, I want to take that again because the way they kind of mark it was like, a little bit skippy. So I'll take that paragraph again, please. Talking about the post-war propaganda, okay? A Yoruba man, Obafemi Awolowo, was the Minister of Finance, who was said to be responsible for the policy of starvation as an instrument of war that accounted for most of the death on the Igbo side. In an army in which the Yoruba representation had been fairly insignificant, the Yoruba officers suddenly took center stage. The one division led by Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, a Yoruba man born to a Fulani mother, the 3rd Marine Commando Division, was the spearhead of the federal assault on Igbo land. In the final act of this tragedy, it was the same Marine Commando Division, by now under the command of another Yoruba officer, Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo, that carried out Operation Finishing Touch, the January 1970 final assault on the Biafrans. There was much more than a sense of irony in the image of the Yoruba man, Obasanjo, accepting the surrender of the Biafran forces from their commander, Major General Philip F. Young. In the prologue to his memoir on the Biafran War, F. Young narrates the story of a meeting long before the war in November 1965 with a mysterious old man who had come in to see him on the pretext of a show of appreciation for admitting his nephew into the army. F. Young wrote in his memoirs, after a while, he looked at my palms and started telling me about the crisis the country was going to go through and the enormous bloodshed that was going to follow. Of course, I was very skeptical and told him that he was probably seeing the bloodshed in the West. Operation Wetie was already on. I pointed out to him. He shook his head and went on to say that he had seen me in the midst of a crisis that was more like a war. To cut a long story short, the old man left me in no doubt about the ugly prospects and said that he would do all that was necessary to protect me because I was a good man. He also asked me to remember him when everything he had told me come to pass. I gave him an indulgent smile before he left. At the end of the war in 1970, I sought out Nicholas Anyaru, then a lieutenant colonel in the Supreme Headquarters of Major General Yakubu Gowon, head of state and commander-in-chief of the Nigerian Armed Forces. He recalled the meeting with the old man, but told me that the man had not been his uncle. Anyaru had met him for the first time by mere coincidence at the ordnance depot gates, and he had insisted on seeing me. When he told me that he had never seen the man again and did not know his name or where he had come from, it became even more significant that what the man had told me had come to pass. Much more was to come in terms of the damage to future Southern relations from the post-war rehabilitation policy. Again, credited to Awolowo, whereby Igbos were to receive 20 pounds each to restart their lives following a change of currency that had reduced the value of their pre-war saving to zero. In a country that had never been able to count the living properly, figures for the dead from the Biafran War are unreliable. They range from 1 million to close to 3 million. The old partnership between North and East had died with the Biafra War, at least for the time being. The new partners were the North and the West, symbolized by that image of Obasanjo accepting F. Young's surrender on 15th January 1970, ended the dramatic event which had begun precisely 4 years earlier, on 15th January 1966. This symbolic act confirmed Obasanjo as a principal military figure amongst the Yoruba, and with the Eastern region's defeat in the whole of the South, it would become the platform for the major role that it would now play in the country as it prepared to enter a long phase of military rule. So let me take a break. I left, what happened is this, right? I left my teacup out there. I'm going to go grab it. So we have a chapter 9, and I hope I could probably just finish that, and then that will be it, right? So bear with me.
Ayégún làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó lódodo. làwa mọ̀ àmọ̀ tó dòdòdò. Ayé ti dé o, ọ̀rẹ́ aráyé.
Thank you so much.
Lórí Facebook.
Those of you who have been, who are part of this morning or afternoon, I want to believe that we have a chapter 9, and I think we should get down to it straight up, because we are going to be reading about. I'm reading about 40 to 46 pages, and it seems that we've only just done about, just about maybe 15 or so yet. So we still have about 30 pages to go. So let's get down to it. Chapter 9, from General Obasanjo to President Obasanjo. In the retrospect of 40 years, it is clear that this was a grave mistake, which has cost many lives and will probably continue to do so. It would have been better to establish several smaller states in a free trade area. Sir Peter Smithers. So, military rule. With the slogan, "No victor, no vanquish," the soldiers, under the leadership of General Gowon, set to put the broken union back together. The experience with democratic self-rule had been short-lived, spanning barely 6 years from independence. But if the politicians had been inexperienced, the soldiers were even more so, because Nigeria's military independence came much later than political independence. For the first 5 years,